Hello, everyone. We have Nordregio researchers Anna Karlsdóttir and Heleniak who work with topics such as immigration, demography, integration, and the labor market. And would like to ask you, what are the most prominent changes we see now in the immigration and the labor market areas caused by pandemics?
From my perspective, I mean, obviously there's been a lot less movement, a lot less mobility, and a lot less immigration into the Nordic countries. In the past years, immigration has accounted for about 2/3 of the population growth in the Nordic region, and the percent foreign-born has reached historic highs. And you're likely to see both of these decline going forward. The impact on employment will be different across the Nordic countries and across the Nordic regions, and probably across socioeconomic groups. So it could be that some of the newly arrived immigrants who are trying to get a foot in the labor market will have a bit more difficulty doing so going forward.
I also think it deeply affects the recruitment patterns among some or within some sectors that have heavily relied on migrant labor earlier, but are now dealing with shortage of labor and do not have a possibility of relying on the usual migrant labor. So this will this is both addresses a challenge, but maybe also opportunities in the end.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the research of integration and labor market, do you already see any changes that you might take into account while doing a research in these fields?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the situation with the border closures is one that people are looking at. It's a bit unusual. I mean, there's supposed to be freedom of movement within the EU, and the Nordic countries being touted as the most integrated in the world. And you're seeing, at least temporarily, much less integration. In terms of researchers, obviously a lot of people are shifting their focus to this more immediate situation of the pandemic and its impacts. One area that I particularly noticed is that statistical offices have been called upon to release data much quicker than they usually do. Usually the collection and processing and analysis of demographic data is kind of slow, but it seems to have sped up quite a bit. And each of the statistical offices is collecting and publishing data, special data on mortality, migration, other areas that where the impacts of COVID is being felt.
I also think that the sudden rise of unemployment and the involvement of state is also affecting the research questions that we probably will be focusing on. An example is just a couple of weeks ago, the Polish state organized flights from Iceland for Polish immigrants there back to Poland. And then also all this financial input into rescuing certain sectors and sectors where migrant labor has been rather not dominant, but in numbers. This all is something that is food for reflection for research.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to Nordregio conducted research, what we could offer for the future, how could we deal with this post-pandemic world?
Yeah, we didn't plan it this way, but fortunately the State of the Nordic region was released just prior to the pandemic and the shutdown. So we had good timing there. So we have a lot of data in there that goes up to 2019. So it provides a nice baseline to look at changes, demographic changes going forward in terms of fertility, mortality, and migration. And I know one thing that I'm going to be doing a bit more, usually we look at data on an annual basis, but a lot of the effects you won't see that much, for a couple of years. So I'll be looking a lot more at quarterly, monthly, and even weekly data on migration, mortality, and other areas to really measure the impact.
Yes, and I think fertility and mortality is something that is highly relevant in the post-pandemic future. I don't have any scientific proof of it, but I'm pretty sure that this crisis, as many others, will produce a baby boom. And yes, I think there's also a very interesting question on how youth initial steps in the labor market will be affected by this. And then I think that the question of transferable skills is more relevant than ever.